Okay, so welcome everybody to our session on limiting beliefs. Just a quick introduction before we get stuck into the content. So as you can see, I'm Caitlin. I'm a learning and development partner at Dunelm. Hopefully you all know Dunelm. I know some of my Dunelm colleagues are on the call. But yeah, hopefully you all know us already. So like I said, I'm a learning and development partner, and I partner with our tech community. So it's really great to be able to join this for the Read Women in Tech community as well. So I support the technical and behavioural development for our tech colleagues, and topics like this, so like limiting beliefs and your more kind of psychological content is what I really love working on. So yeah, let's get into the session. So these are our objectives for today, so that you'll understand the theory behind limiting beliefs. You'll be able to identify what type of stored beliefs you have already. We all have these stored beliefs, so you'll be able to kind of categorize what yours are. And then you'll know how to reprogram any of those unhelpful beliefs into helpful ones. So I would like to preface this with bear with me while we go through a bit of theory. We do have a few activities to help you to understand it, but understanding the theory is really the foundation of being able to make any positive changes that you might want to make once you've kind of identified anything that you would like to change. Okay, so we'll start off with a bit of a story. I love a story in a session. So this story fable comes from a book called The Art of Being Brilliant, which is by Andy Cope and Andy Whitaker. The foundations of this session are based on 2, maybe 3 books, and I'll go through those at the end of the session if you'd like to do a bit of further reading. But in this story, there's an elephant who travelled with a circus, and the owner of the elephant figured that the elephant was one of the main attractions, so he always positioned her at the entrance to the big top. All the children had the thrill then of lining up and feeding the elephant on their way in, except, of course, that you can't just let an elephant loose. She had to be tethered. So if you look closely on this image here, the real image of the real elephant, you can see that we've got a 4-ton elephant that has a rope around their back ankle. Looking even closer, you can notice that that rope is tied with just a tent peg, and the tent peg has just been hammered into the grass. So revising that scenario, you've got a 4-ton elephant with a rope around their ankle, and they're tied to a tent peg. Let's say it's been raining, so the peg isn't hammered into the ground anymore, and the owner has just pushed that tent peg into the soft turf with the palm of their hand and then said, that should hold you to the elephant. So the question here really, why doesn't the elephant run away, and why don't they look, to move themselves, take a look at that tether that's pretty inadequate for them and actually disappear? So open question really, if anyone's happy to answer either verbally or through the chat. Why isn't our elephant running away here?
It's got a limiting belief. It thinks it can't run away.
Yeah, why does she think she can't run away, Pretty?
Because although it's not a strong enough rope to hold the elephant, she sees that as an anchor. So mentally, this rope that she could walk, pull away from is something that's an anchor. Also, maybe it's the way that she's been spoken to, which is making her think, oh, well, it will hold me. If he said that should hold me, then maybe it will. Do you know, that kind of stuff? And
yeah, so a few things, a bit of like conditioning, really.
Oh.
Yeah, go on, Rebecca.
Sorry, I was just going to, I think you were about to say anyway that I think potentially in the past, whenever she's tried to get away, she hasn't been able to because her leg's been tethered. So she doesn't even try anymore because she knows the rope's around her leg.
Yeah, every other attempt has been in vain. So
could it be
yeah,
like
why
fear of
keep trying?
consequence as well? Like she's perhaps done this before and like gotten away, and then there's been like a negative consequence for doing that. So despite the fact that even though she could just pull it out of the ground quite easily, the consequences that she previously had, she's fearful of those consequences again. So it's easier to stay where they are and tethered than it is to face those consequences potentially again.
Yeah, definitely. And I am an animal rights activist and proud advocate of and ally to animals, so I wouldn't condone this sort of environment. But she grew up in a circus, and let's also say, you know, when she was a calf, she had maybe a chain around her ankle that was also padlocked to something a bit more sturdy, like maybe like a lamppost. And then she's trying to escape, but it just results in a sore ankle, or maybe even worse, maybe she got whipped for trying to escape. So now that she's grown up, she's learned that she can't escape, and her knowledge and all her experiences have all shown her that when she's tried to escape, she couldn't escape. And like Chris has put in the chat, it's a learned behaviour. So previously, she was anchored and tethered correctly, so she wasn't able to get free. So the things that are holding her back here, really, you know, we can think, is it the rope? Is it her owner, the keeper? Is it that she's comfortable and being fed every day? Really, what the conclusion you're coming to, and Pretty said it right at the start about the limiting belief, which is why it's part of our session here today. It's her belief system. So that the rope, we can view it as being symbolic. You know, we aren't actually an elephant tied to a pole, but it's an example here of learned helplessness. So we can kind of question ourselves, maybe not as literal as are we this elephant, but are we in a situation similar to this, tethered to something, to a belief system that we see as limiting ourselves when it doesn't actually have to. So you don't change behavior at the level of behavior. For breakthroughs to happen, you need to change your belief system, which is what we'll be looking into now. So thank you everyone for your answers there. It's great to have some participation. So for a lot of us, a large part of our belief system can look like this. So it's riddled with what are known as those limiting beliefs. So these are those niggly things that stop us, they hold us back, they make our confidence crumble. And yeah, you might have a look at these and be like, yeah, I think that might just be limiting beliefs bingo. So with no confidence, we then can't be at our best, we stop ourselves from reaching our potential. What can then happen is we make our lives smaller, so we'll be more fearful of things like conflict, we won't speak our minds, we end up building resentment for situations that we're not able to communicate openly in. And when we're doubting our capability, it can be really helpful to remind ourselves of who we are and what it is that we can achieve. So taking us on to the theory. So this is where I'm a bit like, bear with me, because potentially theory heavy, but some of it might be a bit more familiar to you. So you might be familiar with the Chimp Paradox already, but no worries if not, because I'll go through the basics of some of that theory to make sure we've all got a foundation of understanding of that. But it's a model that was created by Professor Steve Peters in his best-selling books. So you might have heard of the Chimp Paradox as a book on its own. And there's also a newer edition called A Path Through the Jungle, which a lot of this is from, but the foundations of it come from the same theory. So in there, he explains how our mind is split into different systems. You can see here the chimp, the human, and the computer. So the chimp interprets the world through emotions, the human through logical and factual things, and the computer takes information that's been given to it by the chimp and the human to decide a course of action. So we will look at each of these a bit more closely. So not to cause offence to anyone, but as humans, we're close biological relatives to the great apes. So chimpanzees, gorillas, bonobos, and orangutans. And the first system in our mind is similar to that of those great apes and many other animals, but especially chimpanzees. And this part of our thinking system is based in the limbic area of our brains. And when this system takes over our minds, we often display similar behaviours to those chimps. So the chimp mind has survival at its agenda, and it works with drives and instincts and uses emotion as its basis for learning. So we've got some traits on screen here of the chimp mind being in action. So jumping to opinions, being a very black and white thinker, so not thinking of nuance, potential paranoia, catastrophic thinking, so thinking things are the end of the world, being irrational, and making judgments based on emotions. An important thing to know from this is that you're not in control of your chimp, so you can't change what it thinks and feels, but you are responsible for managing it. And it's very fast and strong. It's responsible for our survival instincts. So fight, flight, and freeze are all chimp reactions. So it's important that it has these quick responses because they are and it's not an exaggeration, but they are what's responsible for saving our life in many situations. And our chimp isn't good or bad, although we might see it as bad quite easily because we don't want some of those reactions that it has. So it's not really moral or immoral, but sometimes its approach isn't what we want it to be and can be unhelpful for us. So we don't want every reaction to be a chimp reaction. So the next system of thinking is the human, and this is based in a different part of our brain, so the frontal cortex of them. And this is the part of the mind that you are in control of and is effectively who you really are or who you really want to be. And your human learns by using logic and reason. It's much more rational. So the traits that we can see here, it's much more able to be objective. It can think of the nuance that the chimp can't think of. It's able to listen before making a response, and it uses logic to make its decisions instead of being emotional, instead of emotions being the foundation of all the decisions. And then we have our third system. So this is a computer, again, based in a different part of our brain. I never know if I'm pronouncing it right. I also need to listen to audiobooks and things, but I think it's like the parietal area of the brain, and it stores information and memories and carries out what's known as automatic behaviours and thinking. So we are able to program our computer by putting beliefs or behaviours that we want and that we find constructive into it. And you can do that by practicing behaviours that you want to perform and then turning them into habits and thinking through establishing beliefs to reinforce those habits. So our computer operates quickly, and it advises our chimp and human in making decisions. Because of this, it's really important to check what's stored in your computer, because both the chimp and the human are able to fill it with information. And I'm sure you can imagine from the previous slides, the chimp is likely to fill it with things that are much more emotional and irrational, and then the human is going to be much more rational and objective and use evidence with what it would program the computer with. So we've got more helpful and more unhelpful beliefs that are in there. And it's what's stored in the computer is what we're going to focus on in more detail. So the next part of the theory. The content of the computer is really important to us. And we know that the computer has two functions, so storing factual information and beliefs or memory from the human and the chimp, and then automatically acting on what's been programmed by them. And those stored beliefs can be categorized with three characters that you can see on screen. So gremlins, goblins, and autopilots. And I'm sure you can tell by the names of each of these that some of them are a little bit more troublesome than others. And there might be some that, aren't going to really be very helpful and beneficial for us. So our gremlins, these are unhelpful or destructive automatic behaviours. What's really important to know about gremlins is that they are automatic behaviours and beliefs that can be removed. So we can change these. So an example of a gremlin could be thinking that you're not as good as everybody else. Also thinking that you're better than other people could be a destructive gremlin because it's not a very positive belief to hold. Maybe thinking that you'll fail at things that you want to do as well could be a gremlin. But gremlins and goblins are very individual to each of those. Oh, the slides have stopped presenting. Is everyone else okay with the slides? Because sometimes PowerPoint Live can cause some issues. Okay. See you in a moment, Adele. Then on to goblins. So goblins are unhelpful or destructive automatic behaviours or beliefs that are really resistant to being removed. So this is something that's much deeper rooted. So maybe believing that you're just not capable of something. You're not a leader. You aren't it's like an identity. You are not something. Because they're much more deeply rooted, goblins are likely to be linked to traumatic experiences and life events, and that can be both in childhood or in adulthood. And it's really important to be able to distinguish between the gremlins and the goblins so that we're not putting unrealistic pressure on ourselves to change what might be impossible or really, really hard to change. So we will be looking at how we can change gremlins, but we're not going to be tackling goblins today because it sounds rude again, but there's something that if you do identify goblins, you'd need a bit more support with being able to move that and I don't have the qualifications to be able to do that with or for you today. Also, it'd be a lot to expect from an hour. So then we have our autopilots, and these are helpful or constructive automatic behaviours and beliefs. So an example could be thinking that you can only do your best, being in a sticky situation, or something's coming up and you positively think that you can only do your best, or that you can always learn from any outcome. So you're not saying that the outcome has to be a certain way, but you're saying that, either way, you've got a learning experience there. So gremlins and autopilots are things that are learned from us, and some of the gremlins and autopilots are behavioural, others are beliefs or emotional based. And there are ways that we can reprogram program and reprogram the computer to learn how we want to react in situations. So an example, so let's say someone's decided that they want to tidy their garage that's really messy and cluttered. The humans decided that they want to start that work today, but their chimp's concerned that they think that task is a little bit too big. So as they open the door to the garage, the chimp panics, goes to the computer for advice. And what happens next depends on what's being put into the computer. So if there's a gremlin that says, you'll never get that done, there's no point in starting, then the person that's gone to clean up their garage is likely to feel overwhelmed and never start it. But if they've got an autopilot in the computer that's been programmed to deal with situations that are overwhelming, they might turn out differently. So an autopilot here might look like, or might sound like, don't look at the whole task, just take a small step first. And then it's likely that the chimp then is also able to make a small start and actually crack on with clearing this garage. So our autopilots and gremlins are unique to us. So unhelpful beliefs, behaviours or habits stored in our computer that haven't been considered can then start to sabotage the way that we think. So they're both advising the chimp and the human, and the advice can be changed by working on what's stored in the computer. I knew this, I had this in my mind as we were coming up to this slide. I was like, they're in the wrong order because I remember delivering this session and the names are wrong. So I'll read through these. So the first one, just to recap, that's the purpose of this. So the first one is our gremlin. And our gremlin is those unhelpful and destructive automatic behaviours that can be removed. So important things to remember is that it can be removed. Then we have our goblins, and these are unhelpful or destructive automatic behaviours and beliefs that are really, really resistant to be removed. It takes a lot of work and persistence to be able to remove those. So not what we can tackle or start tackling today. And also you're more likely to need support to be able to do that. And then we have our autopilots, and these are helpful or constructive automatic behaviours and beliefs. So what we are going to do now is a bit of an activity, and Kevin is kindly going to pop you all into breakout rooms for this in a moment, and he's just dropped into the chat the document that you'll need. So all it is a bit of a click and drag activity, and I'd like for you to read through each of these scenarios and decide together whether you think that person is operating with an autopilot, a gremlin, or a goblin. So just click and drag the little icon that represents each of those. And then when you come back, we'll work through them and see which ones you categorised as which and why it is. Welcome back, everyone. Hopefully that was enough time. I always like it when we catch the end of your conversation, but I just had the end of a laugh, which is also really nice to hear. Yeah, so hopefully you managed to work through those. So what we'll do is we'll go through each of these, and hopefully you've got someone from each group that's happy to talk through what your answers were. So I can't see which each of the groups were, but do we have maybe two people? So one from each group that's happy to go through the answers? Yeah, we've got Michaela and, oh, my screen's gone funny. I can't see anything.
Same.
Anyone other than Michaela for the other group?
Yeah, I'll do it.
Thank you, Chris. Okay, so number one, so we've got Christopher. So Christopher has to deliver a presentation to the board. He's nervous, so he's prepared his slides and notes well in advance. Michaela first, is he operating with a gremlin, goblin, or an autopilot?
Let me open our document. We thought he was autopilot in that group.
Any reason why?
it's the fact that he can anticipate and prep, and knows how to kind of mitigate a sort of learned response was kind of the way that the team spoke about it. But yeah, please do comment, team, if that's not quite right.
Thank you. And Chris, did your group say the same?
We did, yeah, and it was because it's a positive behaviour is the main reason we went with autopilot.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you. Yeah, autopilot on that one. So some of them actually might have differing opinions, but you probably would have run out of icons if you put more as for each one. So we'll see how that played out. So Sophie's watching her manager deliver a presentation and she thinks she'd never be able to do it herself. So I'll come to you first, Chris, this time. Do you think autopilot, gremlin or goblin?
So on this one we went with gremlin. So it's something that you could change if you had some more chances to do some presentations or some training.
Thank you. Michaela, any different in your group?
No, we had exactly the same.
Wonderful. Also gremlin. So then on to James. So James grew up with an absent father, so now fears rejection from friends, family and partners. Back to you, Michaela.
Okay, so we thought because it was such a deep-rooted situation here, we had goblin for James.
Okay. And any different for your group, Chris?
No, we had goblin as well.
Yeah. Thank you. Yes, it's mention of it being his absent father, so typically something a bit more deep-rooted. So then Elizabeth, she fell off a horse in her riding lesson and she's now so afraid that she refuses to return for more lessons. So Chris.
Yeah, for this one we also had a goblin because a phobia is quite deep-rooted as well.
Yeah, and Michaela, I saw you nodding, so in agreement?
We had the same. There was a bit more debate about it, whether it would be a belief that could be worked upon, but we ended up with a goblin.
Yeah, and this is where we tend to find a bit more of a grey area in thinking, you know, like the last time I delivered this, someone was like, I fell off a horse and I was okay. So it does depend on the person, but it's possible that someone could need a bit more extra support with this. So sake of the activity, we'll put goblin. So Charlotte's stuck in traffic heading to work, she'll be late to work, so calls her line manager to let them know. So Michaela?
We had, let me just zoom in again, just a sec. Did we have? Oh, we put autopilot for this one.
Yeah, why an autopilot?
So the team thought it was just like an automatic behaviour that's learned, obviously as long as she's on hands-free and being safe. It was like a useful learned behaviour to mitigate against the potential issue.
Yeah, and Chris, in agreement?
Yes, definitely.
Thank you. Yeah, autopilot. On to Harry, who's brought some cake in for a charity bake sale, and he thinks his is way better than everyone else's, and will surely sell out first. So what was this one, Chris?
So we had a little bit of debate on this one, but we did end up going with the gremlin. But yeah, we could see that narcissistic behaviours could also potentially be a goblin. But yeah, we went with gremlin in the end.
Yeah, so maybe it depends on how extreme this belief system is. And Michaela?
Again, we had both at one point, but we switched to goblin because of the sense that this could have real fundamental consequences, and it sounds like there's a really entrenched sort of self-belief there.
Yeah, okay, understood. So I've got it as a gremlin just because we're not understanding how deep-rooted it is. Completely understand your reasons for saying why it might be a goblin though, and what Chris was saying as well. So if this is really deep-rooted, what is the reason behind this? You know, what could be deemed as like arrogance, or is it just a lot of confidence in his baking abilities? So you can see how it can vary dependent on from person to person. So George's friends are all signing up for a local 5K run next year, but George doesn't think he'll ever be able to complete it. So Michaela?
We went for gremlin here because it's something that could be relatively easily changed by actually taking action and experimenting. That was our thinking.
Yeah, okay. And Chris?
We very much had the same response.
Yeah. So I'd put goblin in this one. Maybe it's me thinking about my own beliefs about my own running. I think understand your reasons. My reasons for it also can be put into question. But it's him thinking that he would never be able to complete this. It doesn't say never, but it says ever. So maybe because he's quite like totalist about it, like it's this thing that he'd never be able to do, but also in agreement with a few steps, he might be able to make positive changes. So yeah, no minus points or anything there for that one. So C is anticipating her certification results, but hasn't told anyone as she's sure she's failed. So Chris?
For this one, we had a goblin because they're not reaching out. They're not like showing any of their emotions to anybody outside, and it's really like, I'm not going to tell anybody because I know I haven't done this. I thought that maybe it might need some psychological counselling to bring that one forward.
Yeah, thank you. And Michaela?
We went for a gremlin, so we take the points, like the other team on board. But again, the consensus was that actually more of a gremlin than a goblin behaviour could potentially be changed as soon as you start getting results, or if you did start to reach out.
Yeah. So I also put gremlin, but understand completely Chris's points. So again, how deep rooted is this? Thinking, maybe, having a positive result could be the tipping point as to whether she gets better with this or gets worse with this. But actually, that makes it potentially more likely that it could be a goblin if that's what determines whether she handles this positively or negatively. And then finally, Sam has a lot of work due for an up and coming deadline, and they've broken down their to-do list into tasks for each day leading up to the deadline. Back to you, Michaela.
Yeah, the team were unanimous on this one being a helpful autonomous thing. So I've forgotten the name of it. Autopilot.
Yeah. And Chris, are you in agreement or anything else?
We are, yeah.
Yeah. So also autopilot. So what we're learning here really is that whether something is a gremlin or an autopilot, or goblin can be, so gremlin or goblin is what I mean, can be very different dependent on the person. And it's really understanding how far rooted that is, which we'll come on to later when you're starting to identify them. So although like I've got suggested answers here, but it's just really for that bit of discussion as to why something could be one or another. And we can understand probably a bit more easily why something would be a gremlin for somebody else if it would be for us. And likewise, if it was a goblin for us, would be more understanding of why that would be a goblin for somebody else. So same situation can be very different in terms of how it's kind of programmed or how deeply down it's rooted for each of us. So thank you all so much for your shares. So back to our theory. When the chimp and the human interpret a situation, they'll always check in with that computer for advice. So the computer's only going to give advice that's been put into it by the chimp or the human in the first place. So the computer just recognises a situation and then follows a pattern for dealing with it. So if the computer's programmed with a response to a situation, then it will take over with automatic behaviours. So if it's programmed, it then will respond with a gremlin or an autopilot. So you can see here the quote at the top. So we can change programs in our computer by changing the way we think about something and establishing what is true and what is helpful. So we can replace gremlins with autopilots. And actually, the only way that we can get rid of gremlins is to replace them with autopilots. So we've often put autopilots or gremlins into our minds without even knowing. Usually we have to think about our beliefs in order to recognise how helpful or how unhelpful they are. And then similarly, we need to be able to recognise and replace those destructive behaviours with constructive ones to be able to create positive habits. So we have to kind of manually change those gremlins to autopilots. So how do we do that? The first thing we need to do is find those unhelpful beliefs that we hold in the first place. So they could be some of those examples that I shared earlier with all of those limiting beliefs. But what we have is personal to each of us. So to find your limiting belief, it's helpful to think about why it is you're getting feelings that you're experiencing when they're negative ones, and what it is that you're telling yourself that's kind of creating those feelings. So the thoughts then lead to the feelings. Then we need to decide what beliefs or behaviours we want to replace them with. So the positive things that we want, so those autopilots. So once we recognise an unhelpful belief or behaviour, we then need to replace it with a helpful truth or a helpful behaviour that actually resonates with us. We've got a quick example before we have a look for ourselves. So example here, got a little character that I'm nicknaming Lara. So Lara's driving to an interview for a job, and she really, really wanted that job. As she drove along the road, she heard two absolutely almighty bangs, and then her car juddered as she hit the brakes. She got out of the car safely and looked at it, and then she could immediately see that two of her car tyres had completely burst. So Lara's chimp, we can see here, immediately went into meltdown and lost all perspective, saying, we've blown two tyres, this is the end of the world. So the chimp is focused on the two tyres and the fact that the interview will be missed. There's frustration, there's anger, anxiety, despondency, and that result could be overwhelming for Lara. However, Lara's programmed her computer with a response to say, for any setback, that says, what's the plan? So Lara's able to then snap out of her emotional response. So emotional response will come first because the chimp is first and fastest, but then programming the autopilot can then help break out of that. So then she's able to get to an action that is actually helpful for her. So another example, quite different to this, could be something that makes us lack confidence is maybe thinking that we're not as good as other people. So if we actually ask ourselves, what do you think is good in another person? Our chimps might respond and say that if they're clever or if they look good, but our human might say that they have sound morals, they have a positive outlook. And then those responses are completely different to each other. It's then up to us to decide which answer we want to work with. So if you take that human one, which I'm sure we would want, the much more positive one, you might reflect that you actually do all have all of those qualities of a good person. So then you are a good person. So we're going to do a bit of an activity now. So this is just something to do personally. And just before I start describing it, I'm going to drop something in the chat just to give you a bit of a chance. And Kevin has emailed this to all of our non-Dunelm colleagues, non-Dunelm attendees. I don't know what words I'm using, just because the putting it in the chat won't work. So Dunelm people, you're able to open a copy of that, and then if you could just save it so that you're not all working on the same document, that would be wonderful. And then you should have your own copy if you've joined externally. So what I'd like for you to do is have a look at each of those kind of situations that you could be in. The idea for that situation is that it would trigger some sort of response from you. And I want you to determine initially, what is your response? So how does that make you think and feel about yourself? And then the next thing to do is to identify with what you put in that first column. Is that a gremlin, a goblin, or an autopilot? And remember that we can't tackle goblins today, but gremlins, if you're identifying those, then have a look, start looking at the next column and what autopilot could you program there for yourself that would be much more helpful for you in that situation instead of that gremlin. So you really want your first honest response for what you're putting into the first column, and that will really support the bits that you put later on. So I'll give you a few minutes to work on that. This is our last activity of the session. So and then I'll leave you to that, and then I'll interrupt you in a few minutes just to check how you've gotten on and to close the session. So okay, I feel like I have to really rudely interrupt you. So sorry for that. I asked you to do something and then I'm interrupting you to stop you. And I know that won't have been enough time to work through them all and to come up with, proactive autopilots, but perhaps consider it a bit of homework maybe, or a starting point for working with those going forwards, and a bit of a template maybe if you want to tackle some that aren't on there that you are able to identify. So I guess just a couple of questions before we wrap up the session. So with that, oh, Pretty, you've got your hand up. So let's go to you first before I ask some questions.
Sorry, I just wanted to ask. So, like on some of them, I read the scenario.
Yeah.
And although I did something autopilot initially, I felt a gremlin, if that makes sense. It's almost like, yeah. So, for example, if I got feedback after a project to say, hey, maybe add X, Y, and Z, I'd be absolutely, yes, I'll do that. Do you know, like I wouldn't, that's great, you've
Yeah.
made it better. But then I think I'd be thinking to myself, like, why didn't I pick it up myself? So is that a goblin then?
So a goblin or a gremlin,
Oh yeah,
well, all of
I had it down as a gremlin. I'm just, can it be that you, although you know the autopilot because you behave a certain way, there's still like a little monkey in the back saying, "Oh, here's a banana." You know, like
so
you're
your
still,
chimp will always be there. So your chimp might have that emotional response to it. So that's more about like how you would feel. So if you
yeah,
feel a little bit annoyed that someone gave you a bit of feedback, that might be your chimp response. Whether there's a gremlin or a goblin, that's more about your beliefs and your behaviors. So your behavior there sounds very much autopilot because you're like, yeah, okay, let's correct that, we'll move on. But
yeah,
there might also be a gremlin there as well, because it seems like it might have knocked maybe your self-esteem or how you're thinking about yourself, if you're kind of beating yourself up a bit about why you didn't discover that in the first place, and then what you might think about yourself because of that. So it could branch off into two as well.
okay. That, because I had that one as two, and I just was like, that's normal for me because you know what?
Yeah.
Do you know, like
Yeah. So
I'm
the
not,
important part is to,
upset. Yeah, it's not like I'm fighting back or thinking, oh, I'm annoyed because they gave me negative, or not negative, but they gave me criticism, like constructive criticism, or they gave me feedback on, hey, maybe add X, Y, and Z. So that's not an issue. I think it's more, damn, why didn't I pick it up? Do you know that
so
that's
that's
the
why the
annoying bit?
important part of it is the how do you think and feel about yourself.
Yeah,
And if there's something there that's unhelpful, then you've got a gremlin or a goblin that you want to
yeah.
tackle.
Thank you.
Helpful? Cool,
Yes.
thank you. So how did we, just quickly because we're getting to the end, how did we find being able to distinguish between the autopilots, the gremlins and the goblins? We okay with that? Yeah. And then it might take a bit of time, a bit of practice, working out what your helpful behaviour could be. But definitely, you need to be able to identify what the autopilot would be in order to be able to change your ways of responding and thinking and feeling about yourself. So yeah, thank you all for partaking in that. What if most of them are goblins? If they're goblins, then tackle the ones that are most important to you first, and also be kind to yourself. You can't give yourself a complete overhaul and change all of this in one go. Work bit by bit on each of them. But yeah, starting off with what's most important to you. So hopefully we've covered all of this off today. So you understand the theory behind limiting beliefs and can identify which ones you have stored. And then you'll know how to reprogram unhelpful beliefs into helpful ones. So the starting point of that, but hopefully that's useful for you moving forwards. Also, just to share a bit of, some post-court session reading, if that be of interest, but these are what really inspired the session. So Path Through the Jungle and the Chimp Paradox from Professor Stephen Peters, and then The Art of Being Brilliant, which is where the story of the elephant came from. And there are loads of other great stories with morals and other useful tools and tips in that book to help you to be your best. So yeah, that's the end of the session. Lovely to meet all of you. Thank you for joining, and I hope it was useful for you. And yeah, it's something that you can use moving forwards. And have a great rest of your week, everyone. Bye.
Thanks, Caitlin. Bye
Thank
bye.
you.
Thanks, Caitlin. Bye.
You're welcome. Bye.